Welcome to So Lounge. Today we are working with McCall's 8220, which is a dolman sleeve shirt that buttons up the front. If you've been wondering how to start sewing your shirt together, we're going to go through all of the first steps today, so stay tuned. So Lounge is the place to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions or comments, leave them below and I will get back to you. Now, we have previously added links to this pattern and we have cut out our fabric in this really brightly colored striped Japanese linen. And now we are ready to move on to the actual construction phase and start putting this together. So before we go any further, make sure that you have all of your pattern pieces cut out, that you have transferred all the marks from the pattern to your fabric, and then we'll be ready to keep going. So get out your pattern instructions and let's go in for a closer look. Just as a reminder, we are going to be making sleeve A. The directions are the same for A and C, and that's good because we have added the length of C and the sleeve of A together to make our own unique creation. If you are following along and just making the straight pattern, then these are the ones we're talking about today. Now, if we look at pattern instruction number 1, it has to do with attaching the interfacing to the fabric. We are going to skip over that for now and take care of that before we start putting all the facings together and attaching them to the shirt. Today, we are starting with step number 2, and that is going to be gathering the front edge of piece number 1. And remember, we've got 2 of those, and we're going to do that first, and then we are going to move to step number 3 and sew the center back together. And then we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to skip ahead to step number 6 to finish our sleeve, or at least press our sleeve in place to get that edge finished before we move on to step number 4 to sew the shoulder seam and the underarm seam. And then last, we will put in that hem. If you look at the instruction for step number 2, it says gather the front edge between the 2 large circles. Now, you may be wondering, what in the world are they talking about? So first of all, make sure that you transferred the 2 large circles to the front edge of your fabric. And then we're going to do some basting. So in order to gather, we have to run a couple of rows of basting stitches along that front edge in order to then pull those threads to gather our fabric between those 2 points. And the way you create a basting stitch is by setting your sewing machine to the very longest stitch length, and that will give you a very long stitch. Now, we are going to stitch between these 2 dots. We're going to put in 2 rows of stitching because then it's a little bit easier to gather and to control that gather when you have 2 rows to work with. We are going to leave the ends of our thread long so that we can manipulate them to make those gathers. And the very last thing we're going to do is sew inside the seam allowance. Now, on commercial patterns, the standard seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, and we want to sew inside of that. That way we know that our gathered basting stitches are not going to show. The stitch lines are not going to show once we put our garment together. So I am going to start out by, let's see, it's 5/8. I think I'm going to start out by sewing at a 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start with the bigger one first. I'm going to start at a 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to sew between the outside edge and that 1/2 inch stitch at a 1/4 of an inch. And that will keep everything inside of the stitch line, and it will be easy to gather. So once you get your pattern piece ready to go, you have your machine threaded, and you have it set to a basting stitch, let's go in for a closer look. So you can see here that I have a mark here. It's kind of a yellowish colored mark, and there's another one a little bit lower down here. Those are the 2 marks I'm going to be stitching between to make those gathers. And I have my thread tails. I'm going to pull them out a little bit so they're longer. And we are going to be sewing from the top mark down the front of the garment towards the hem to put in this first line of basting stitches. Now, I'm going to start out at a 1/2 inch, so that is going to be this mark on my sewing machine. And you can grab a seam gauge and measure that. If you have a magnetic seam gauge, that is a great tool to line up against so that you know you are staying where you're supposed to be, and it's a little bit easier to follow than just trying to stay up on that line. So I am just going to lower my presser foot, and I do have my machine on the longest stitch, and now I'm just going to sew around, keeping this outside edge all lined up, making my basting stitches, and just take the curve at your own speed, don't rush. And we're going to come back down to the second dot here. I'm going to raise my needle. I'm going to keep these thread tails long because we want to be able to gather. So that is the first row of basting stitches. Now we're going to go in and put in the second row. We're going to put this one inside closer to the edge because remember, we're going to be stitching at 5/8 of an inch to connect the facing to these gathers, and we want to make sure they're not seen once we get this all put together. So I'm going back up to the same mark. The 1/4 of an inch is from my needle to the outside edge of the presser foot, so I'm just going to get lined up at that same spot, and then I'm just going to repeat this process of basting. Now I'm still keeping everything lined up. I'm taking my time to go around this curve. Do not pull your fabric. Try and work with it as best you can without pulling it. We do not want to pull it off grain, but you are gathering, so there is a little bit of leeway here. Okay, so I'm back to that mark right here. I'm going to lift my needle. I'm going to keep these thread tails long. And now I have those sewn in. Once you get yours sewn in, go sew the other front panel. We are moving on to step number 3, which is putting our center back seam into our shirt, and we are going to pin the 2 center back pieces together along these notches. Now, you may not have noticed this. It took me a while to pick up on this when I was learning to sew, but 3 notches always means center back seam. 2 notches means side seam, and you will have a single notch on the front for a front seam, or in this case, we're going to be attaching the facing to the single notch on the front. So just something to keep in mind. I did not figure that out for quite a while, so I thought I would share that with you in case you were unaware. Now, the next thing we're going to be doing is sewing in our center back seam, and when I sew, I always sew from the neckline down to the hem. And you may be thinking that, does it really matter? Yes, it does. And this is why. Because the rate that your feed dog feeds the bottom fabric is going to be a little bit different from the speed and the top that the top feeds through. So there's going to be a slight difference between the top piece of fabric and the bottom piece of fabric. And depending on your machine, that could be more or less. So it's something that I really had not noticed on my Bernina for quite a while until I sewed a very long wrap skirt. And then you can kind of notice that there's a little bit of a difference on that panel that is on the bottom. So there will be a little bit longer. Now, the bonus of sewing from the neck or from the waist down towards the hem is that if this happens, and depending on the degree of shift, you can always adjust it into the hem. So you can just adjust it and not have to worry about it. If you sew from the hem to the neckline and your fabric is a little bit off, it's going to be much harder to either attach a facing or a collar or anything like that. So that's why I sew this way. That's why I recommend you sew this way. It'll make your life a lot easier in the long run. And it may not be something you notice in like a shirt like this, but trust me, when you start sewing a dress or a long skirt, you will notice it, and then you'll be like, huh, how did that happen? It's not you, it's just the way the sewing machine works. So don't feel bad, but it's one of those things we can fix in the hem. Other thing to note before we sew the seam is that we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch. That is the standard commercial seam allowance unless otherwise indicated. It does not say anything else, so we are going to be stitching at 5/8 of an inch. Last but not least, make sure you turn off your basting and readjust your stitch length. You do not want to baste this in and then have to go back in and rip that out and put in your permanent stitch line. I like to sew at a 2.5 length. That is a good sturdy length, but then it's also not too difficult to rip out if I make a mistake, but I don't think I'll make one here. Once you get your machine set and your fabric pinned together, let's go in for a closer look. Once you have everything pinned and ready to go, if you do not know where 5/8 of an inch is on your machine, you can grab a little seam gauge and measure that out. It's usually going to be the first long line on your plate, and I am going to still put my magnetic seam gauge over there to just keep us all lined up. I'm going to take out this first pin, and then I am going to lower my presser foot to get started. Now I am starting like about 1/4 of an inch, or it's probably about 1/8 of an inch from the top edge of my fabric, and then I'm going to back stitch. So I'm going to roll my needle in to get started. I'm going to take a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch to go back up to that top edge, and then I'm going to come forward again. Now that's just going to prevent the thread snarl from happening underneath. Sometimes you may have noticed you'll have this ball of thread under there and you have to stop and rethread. That's why. So if you start with your needle down and just a little bit below the edge and then back stitch, that will always help you. I am just stitching at 5/8 of an inch, removing each pin as I get to it. And as always, there is no rush. So just take your time, keep everything lined up. Remove each pin as you get to it. And we are just coming down to the bottom edge. Make sure that's all lined up. Take out that pin. Just keep sewing. I am going to backstitch at the bottom of this because we are going to be working with this later, and I do not want this center back seam to start coming out. So just do a couple stitches back, come off the front edge, lift your presser foot and your needle, and now we have our center back seam. I have made the executive decision that we are going to do part of step number 4, and we are going to sew the shoulder seams to attach the front panels to that back panel that we just put the center back seam in. Now, once we do this, then we'll go forward and finish the sleeve, but it doesn't make sense to do that without at least connecting the fronts and the back together. And we're going to do that at the shoulder because that's going to be the easiest part to sew, and it's just going to hold everything together nice and neat. So match the notch at your shoulder and then match the whole edge of your 2 pattern pieces together so that they match up at the bottom and the top, and then we are going to be stitching. You are keeping your machine at your regular stitch length, and we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch, just as we did for the center back seam. Let's go in for a closer look. I have my fabric matched up at the notch and then also at this top neck edge. I'm going to lower my presser foot, and as usual I'm just a little bit below that top edge because I am going to back stitch. I'm going to roll in my needle to get started, and I'm going to take a couple stitches forward, and then I'm going to back stitch to go back up to that edge and finish that before continuing with my stitch line along the shoulder seam. Still removing each pin as I get to it. Make sure your fabric is laid out nice and smooth on your work surface so that it doesn't fall off the front and get you out of alignment. So take out this pin, and my sleeve is not lying flat under here, as you can see. There we go. Got that all lined up again, and continue stitching. all out. All right. And we are in the home stretch. I'm just going to remove that pin, and we are going to back stitch at the edge of the sleeve, since we are going to be folding that back and we do not want to have any problems. All right, so just cut off your thread tail. Once you have your whole shoulder seam sewn into place, sew up the other one, and then we will head over to the ironing board. Before we finish the sleeve edges, we need to press our seams open so that once we move on to the sleeve and the hem, we'll have nice pressed seams. And I was recently reading in a book about pressing your seams twice. So pressing them to one side, then pressing them open. So the first time we press, it is helping set the stitches in the actual fabric, which I don't know if it makes a difference or not. I've never done this before, but we'll try it and see if it makes any kind of a noticeable difference to warrant this extra step. So I just went down my seam with it to one side. Now I'm going to just open that up and press it open. And that means it'll be ready to attach the neck band and facing once we get to that step. Remember that pressing is lifting up and putting down. So I'm just lifting my iron and putting it down, lifting and putting it down, and moving it down the seam. It is not pushing back and forth. That is ironing. We just want to press to keep these seams open and to have our fabric stay in place as we continue to work. Now my iron is set for cotton linen, which is the highest setting on my iron. I have the steam on. It is hot. You can see that I kind of burned my hand a little bit. No worries. So next I am going to move on to the shoulder seams. So I'm going to press those just in the direction they're going, which seems to be this way. And then I am going to press them open as well. So just press your seams accordingly. Let it cool because they are hot. Now I'm just going to fold this open, press one more time. I'm going to press that one over, so I'll do that again. I'm just going to go back over again because these are not completely flat. There we go. And since my fabric is a cotton and flax blend, it can take a lot of heat, which is why I have it on this high heat setting. Make sure that you set your iron to whatever is appropriate for your fabric. So once you've got your shoulder seams all pressed, we'll move on to the next step. If you skip ahead to pattern instruction number 6, it says to fold the sleeve an inch and then finish the edge. So we're going to do that, but we are going to do it in a pressing method before we put in that underarm seam. This is going to help us have an easier time of getting that sleeve finished once we do go in and sew that seam. It makes it a little bit easier to work with since you're not working in the round. We're still working with our sleeve being flat and open. So this is my shoulder seam here in the middle, and these outside edges is where we will reconnect the sleeve with the underarm seam. And my method for doing this is going to be folding and pressing. I have a Dritz Easy Hem that has a 1-inch mark on it. I also have a regular seam gauge or hem gauge, and you can use that if you do not have a Dritz Easy Hem. So to get started, I'm just going to start in the middle of the seam. I'm going to fold this up an inch and just go down this whole edge and get it all pressed. If you're using a Dritz Easy Hem, it does get very hot, so be careful and do not burn yourself. Once I get that pressed in, I'm going to take out the Dritz Easy Hem and press it one more time in that same area of my sleeve. And then I'm going to go down to each side and repeat the process. Now, if you do not have a Dritz Easy Hem, you can do the exact same thing with your seam gauge. Just set it to 1 inch and then just press and move down until you have that whole edged finish. Let's go in for a closer look. Using my Dritz Easy Hem, I am just folding this up to the 1 inch mark, and then I'm pressing, and you can see that I've pressed in this edge. Once I remove it, it's all nice and pressed. If you are using a seam gauge or a hem gauge, you can still put that at 1 inch, and then you can measure and go down the edge to make sure it's all lined up and pressing as you go. So I still have this other edge. I need to move this over here so then you can see what I'm doing. And let's use the gauge method. So once you kind of start folding it, you can kind of get it lined up. And then we're gonna go in and press through here. And go down a little bit further, measure and press. Let's say that's about 1 inch the whole way. Yes, okay. So now that I have that all folded where I want it to be, I'm just going to go in and press, use steam, hold that down, let it cool for a second, just double check that it is at 1 inch. And that is how we are going to do the first round of pressing with the sleeve. Now, you may notice that this edge is still raw, and if we leave it like this, that could potentially fray once it goes into the wash. You can finish this edge however you want. If you want to run a zigzag stitch along it, that is totally fine. It is completely up to you, but I prefer the fold and press method. So I'm going to unfold this along this inch line that we put in already. And I'm going to refold it to 1/4 inch and press. And that means that we'll finish that top edge because it'll be pressed to the inside. And then once I go and finish my sleeve, I do not have to worry about that anymore. It'll have a nice finished edge on the inside, and then I can sew it in place with a method of my choosing. So I could do hand sewing like the pattern recommends, or I can just put in a stitch line. I haven't decided what I'm doing yet, so we will figure it out once we get there. So you can just go in, put in that 1/4 inch. If you do not have a Dritz Easy Hem, it is exactly the same process. Just go to that 1/4 inch mark, fold your fabric accordingly, get it all lined up. There we go. Get it all lined up. And I think I pressed it a little bit wide. There we go. The good thing about cotton is that if you press it in the wrong place, you can just go back and repress it. And it's pretty forgiving. So I'm just going to stop here at this seam for demonstrative purposes. And then we will come back. So that is our 1/4 inch. And then we're going to fold it back up, and you can press again. And that should be 3/4 inch if we did all of our pressing correctly. Yes, because we have a 1 inch allowance, and then we have gone in and adjusted accordingly. So go ahead and finish the edge of your shirt sleeve in whatever manner you want, and then we will head back to the sewing machine. Before we go any further in putting together this garment, now would be a good time to point out that if you have fabric that ravels, this would be the time when you finish the edges of your seams. So if your shoulder seam looks like it's raveling and you're concerned about it holding up in the wash, or your center back seam, now's the time to finish them, because once we put in that underarm seam and put the sleeve finish in and finish that hem, then it's going to be too late to go back in and finish your seams. So this is one of those steps that they don't really talk about. If you look at the instructions, it says finishing and it gives you some suggestions, but the only time it actually says finish on the pattern instructions is when we're talking about the sleeve finish and the hem finish. So if finishing your actual seams is important, go and do that step now. I am not going to do it on this fabric. This is not raveling, and this is probably going to be dry clean only, just because there is linen as a component and I do not want it to shrink. So whatever is best for your fabric, you can make that decision at this point in time, but now would be the time to do it, and otherwise it's going to be too late. At this point, you should have the edge of your sleeve pressed, so it's a double fold and pressed. We are going to sew the underarm seam together. So you can just unfold the bottom of the sleeve on both sides. And the good thing about pressing, when you use natural fibers like cotton or linen or wool or combination of any of those, they will keep the memory of being pressed, and then that way you can just fold it back into place once you are ready to get to that step. So I am matching the notch for the underarm seam. So this is kind of between the sleeve. It's in this curve through here. So I'm going to get that matched up on both of my sides so that I'm ready to sew. And I'm going to be sewing from the sleeve down towards the hem for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Make sure you get your machine set to your regular stitch length. If you change that for any reason, go back and fix that now. And once you get everything pinned, let's go in for a closer look. I have my side seams all pinned together and matched at the notches, and I am sewing from the shoulder seam down towards the hem at 5/8 of an inch. So let's just get that all lined up. I'm going to lower my presser foot, get that outside edge lined up with my little magnetic seam gauge. I'm going to take a couple of stitches and then backstitch up to the top, and then I'm going to go forward again. And I'm just following this edge around, removing each pin as I get to it. And I'm just coming around under the curved armhole, underarm sleeve seam, and keeping everything matched up. So I'm just taking my time to go through that curve. To remove the pin. There is a lot of fabric that you probably have on your lap, and it's a lot to keep smooth, so just take your time. I understand that there's a lot going on, so you want to make sure that your seam stays smooth all through here and that you keep everything lined up. It would help if I put my foot on the presser pedal. There we go, foot pedal. There we go. I'm going to remove this and smooth out my seam, smooth it out to the bottom, keep everything all lined up. Coming into the home stretch, and I'm going to backstitch at the bottom of that seam, and now we are done. So this is the bottom hem edge down here. And then this is my sleeve, and now I can go back in, and once we press open the seam, I have a little line to follow there to get this all folded back under, and that's going to be a lot easier than trying to manipulate all of this and press once we have that seam sewn in. Sew up the other underarm seam, and then we will head back to the ironing board to do some more pressing and be on our way. We are back at the ironing board, and before we press the final pressing of the sleeve, we need to press open this side seam to make it lie nice and flat. Now, it is a curve, so as you're looking at it, you may be thinking like, how do I get a curve to lie flat? We're going to clip that curve right here at the notch. So you just want to go in and you want to just make a snip that is perpendicular to your stitch line. You do not have to get super close to it, so leave at least 1/8 of an inch between your snip and that stitch line because you do not want to accidentally cut it. Now it should be a lot easier to press open your seam, especially the bottom half of it. If you need to clip again in that curve, we will do that when we get up to that part of the seam. So I'm just going to press this open on this bottom section down here and let it cool. And then I'm going to move to this top section here. And it looks like we're going to need to put another clip in right here where there's still this curve. So right here in this spot. I'm just going to repeat that, leave about 1/8 of an inch from that seam line. So now we have like, it's going to look like that, and press that all open so that everything lies nice and smooth, and it will be easier to put in the hem and finish the sleeve once this seam is pressed open. So once you get that all pressed, there's a lot of flipping going on here. Okay. I've still got to press this top part of my seam open. I'm trying to keep that smooth underneath. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to press through here, get that open, and let it cool. And I'm not going to press exactly on the very edge because I do not want to accidentally press out my fold lines that I had made when I was finishing the bottom edge of the sleeve. So just kind of press right up to that bottom line where you initially folded that inch. And then we can go back in and start folding this all back into place. It's going to be easier to start from the shoulder seam because that's the part we have not been messing with, and then go around to the bottom and get it all lined up. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so this is a close-up view of what I was talking about with getting everything refolded. So you can see that we still have that line in there. We're going along. This is all pressed in previously, and so that is pretty easy to get back in place. And now we want to just fold this part here at the seam. Now remember, when we made the initial fold, it was 1 inch. So that's the good thing about starting on a fold, is it's easy to get everything lined back up again. So that's our 1 inch mark there. So if you want to just take your iron and just press along that bottom edge, just to kind of get that started, to kind of help our fabric fold a little bit. And then you can see that you can still see that 1/4 of an inch line in there along the top. So I'm just going to very gently fold that under and get that all lined up. And now this should be 3/4 of an inch, which it is, which means we've got everything lined up appropriately. And now I'm going to go back and press the whole thing in place so that it will be ready to go for the final stitching. Now the instructions tell you to do this all by hand. If you don't want to do it by hand, you can totally just sew it with your machine. It kind of just depends on the type of fabric you're using for this top. Now, this is linen, and it is a cute summer top to just wear with jeans or capris, and it's sporty. So I am just going to do a stitch line along here to get this finished and hold this all in place. And that is going to be totally fine for the fabric that I'm using. But if you are using something fancy like a satin or chiffon or some pretty more dressy type of fabric, then you may not want to do that. So I would recommend hand stitching in that instance to finish this. And then the instructions are on the pattern and you can follow those and get that all done. So now that we have this all pressed in, you can see how much easier it's going to be to go in and sew all of this together. And this is our shoulder. Once we unfold it, this is our underarm seam down here. If you want to give those seams another press to just make sure everything is nice and open, that will work. Repeat this process on the other side, and then we are going to press the hem in place before we head back to the sewing machine. Once you have your sleeves all pressed back into place and you have those seam allowances all open and your finished edge is all ready to get sewn, I put in a couple of pins to just hold those in place at the shoulder seam and the underarm seam. And now, before we head back to the machine, we are going to press the hem. So this is the exact same method that I used for the sleeves. I think this is the easiest way to finish this. And for this kind of fabric, it is an appropriate seam finish. So like I said earlier, if you were using a finer, more delicate or fancier fabric, then you may want to do a different type of seam finish. But for this will work for me. Now, if you look at the instructions on the hem, it says to turn the hem under 1 inch and then to finish the edge and then hand stitch it into place. I'm not going to hand stitch this. I'm already going to do a machine stitch to finish those sleeves. I'm going to do the exact same kind of stitch on the hem. And it doesn't matter if it shows because, like I said before, this is kind of a sporty summer top and that is the look I'm going for. If you are going to hand sew the sleeves, you can use your blind hem foot when you put in the hem so that you don't have to hand sew that if you do not want to. I made a video about that. You can check it out. So go ahead and click on that link and you can go watch the step-by-step of sewing a blind hem either by hand or with a foot that most machines have these days. So that's a good way to do that if you are using a finer fabric. If not, stick with me. We are going to press this the exact same way. So we're going to start out at 1 inch. I'm starting at the center back seam. I'm going to press this in place using my Dritz Easy Hem. I think so. If my iron didn't turn off, no, we're good. And then I'm just going to move down that whole edge. Once I have my 1 inch pressed in, I'm going to unfold it and then fold that top edge 1/4 inch, just like before. And then we will head back to the sewing machine. Once you get your hem all pressed into place, I did put a couple of pins in at the center front, the side seams, and the center back seam, just to keep everything lined up. If you look at the instructions for the sleeve finish and the hem finish, it says to baste first, then to finish the edge, and then to hand stitch. So if you are using one of those fancy fabrics we talked about, you can do the basting. I am not going to do the basting because I am putting in a permanent stitch line, so I do not have to make sure that nothing moves while I'm hand stitching. It's all in there, it is pressed, and I'm confident moving forward. So I am going to start with the hem just because then I can just leave my sewing machine exactly where it is. And to get started, I am going to be stitching very close to this folded under edge, probably about 1/8 of an inch. Remember, we did fold that seam allowance 1/4 inch under there, so I want to catch that, and I want to make sure that that's going to be a nice tight finish through there. So I am going to sew very close to the stitch line. And I'm just going to take off my seam gauge because since we are sewing so close, I'm just going to get it lined up with my presser foot. Let's go in for a closer look. As you can see, I have the edge of my fabric lined up on the inside of my presser foot. Between that point and the center point where this line is about 1/8 of an inch. So that is what I'm going to be stitching at. Let me roll in my needle to get started. Oop, too close to the edge. I do not want to mess this up. Let me move that down a tiny bit. There we go. So now I'm just going to roll in my needle. Pull those threads back. There we go. Roll in my needle. And then I'm going to sew forward just like we've done previously. And now I'm going to backstitch. And then I'm going to go forward again. So I'm just keeping that lined up on that inside edge. And moving my shirt up onto my work surface as I am doing this, so that it's not fighting me, which is easier said than done. So take your time and get everything situated. and remove each pin as you get to it. Keep smoothing. And you do not have to sew this fast. I am just trying to expedite this process. Oops. There we go. And I'm just coming into the home stretch. I'm going to pull that pin out and back stitch at this center front edge where we will later attach the facing. All right, so that is going to be my finished hem. You can see it, it's kind of obvious, but you know what, that's okay. I am going to do my buttonholes in blue, and I do like the way that that looks. You can see a little bit better there. So that is my finished hem. If you do not want your hem to show, do a blind hem stitch, and then it will not show. We are going to repeat the exact same process on the sleeves. If you do not like the way that looks, hand sew them, okay? So it is not something you absolutely have to do, but that's what I'm gonna do. Now, because we are sewing a round tube shape, we need to lift up our machine. So if you have a platform around it, make sure that you take that off, or if you're using a sewing table like I am, you want your free arm available because we are going to be working around that sleeve to get it finished. Now, I usually start on the bottom seam, so the underarm seam. That way, if I have to ease anything or if it looks a little funny when I come back around, it's under my arm and it's not up on the top of my arm where everybody can see it. So get everything lined up and take out this pin. We are sewing it in the exact same manner. Start at that underarm seam, and we're still doing the 1/8 of an inch, so it's still going to be very close to this edge. Let's go in for a closer look. I have everything lined up. I'm going to roll my needle down into my fabric to get started. And I'm just going to take a couple of stitches and then back stitch. We are going to be going all the way around, so I can come back over this. You do not have to back stitch because we're basically making a big circle. So I'm still sewing at the 1/8 of an inch. I have my top edge of my seam lined up at that point, and then I'm just feeding my sleeve around as I'm sewing. So because we're sewing in the round, that's why we need our free arm available to assist with this process and to move our fabric. Take out that pin and keep going. And you do not want to get your sleeve twisted, so just take your time to move it around and just stop sewing if you have to. It's not a big deal. And we are getting ready to come back around to where we started. And I'm just going to pull these out of the way and then just go back over that original stitch line, a couple of stitches, and then just go back. And now we are done. So let me trim that. And then this is what our sleeve finish is going to look like once we get it all done. and it's nice and even. If you look at the pattern, it does indicate that you may need to ease in the seam a little bit depending on your fabric. I did not have to with this, plus I pressed everything really, really well to make sure it fit in there right. I need to go back in and press it again, get it nice and smooth, but that is how we finished the sleeve. Repeat on the other side. So once you finish the sleeves and the bottom hem, make sure you trim off any loose threads, and I think it's looking pretty awesome. Like, I'm really excited about this. Do not worry about gathering the front edges. We will deal with that once we get the facing put together and add it all in and get everything matched up. Then we'll do the gather. So don't worry about that. We just had to put them in at this point so we don't have to worry about it later. And I think it's looking pretty cool. I'm really happy about this. And hopefully you are happy with the shirt you were working on too. Stay tuned for the next set of videos, which will be putting together the facing. It's going to be the front facing and the back neck facing. We're going to add interfacing to those. We're going to put those together. We're going to attach them to the shirt and get that all finished. And then there will be a second follow-up video, which will be marking and sewing the buttons and buttonholes. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions, leave them in the comments below and I will get back to you. Until we meet again, happy sewing!